I'm going to talk about, for the next 20 minutes, about the education policy response to support Ukrainian refugees across the OECD. And what I'm going to do is to present preliminary results from a survey of ministries of education. Before I go into the results, just let me give you a little bit of background. We have surveyed ministries of education across OECD countries in late May and early June. We have covered 28 participating countries, and we have focused on three broad topics. First, on the monitoring of Ukrainian children. Second, on the student integration into host countries' education systems. And third, on measures to ensure pedagogical continuity for Ukrainian children. In my presentation, I'm going to speak about all three issues, but I'm going to focus primarily on the point 2 on student integration into host countries' education systems. But let's start very briefly with the monitoring. When we look at the situation across OECD countries, we see that enrollment in educational institutions of children and young adults is monitored in almost all OECD countries, but we also see that there's a large diversity in how it is monitored. So some countries do this monitoring on a daily basis, other countries do it biannually, some countries do it at the school levels, other at the city level, some at the regional level, and quite a few at the national level. And this leads essentially to a situation where we don't have comparable results across all OECD countries, but from the contextual information that we received from many countries, we see actually that at least in the last school year, quite a few children were not enrolled. So, for example, Germany estimates that only 50% of all Ukrainian children were enrolled last year. In Sweden, where enrollment for Ukrainian refugees is not compulsory, there are estimates that actually only 40% were enrolled. And this is, of course, due to a variety of reasons. Of course, many parents initially expected to only stay for a short period in the host countries. Quite a few countries also indicated that some children, especially from Western Ukraine, where schools continue to function to a large degree, continue distance education in their own schools, and that is something that was encouraged by many host countries, at least during the last school year. And a third important point is also that at least during the initial periods of the refugee crisis, many countries also told us that they have not enforced enrollment. That is something that's going to change during the next school year, according to the responses that we have received. So with this, let me come to the focus of this presentation: how students are integrated into host countries' education systems. Of course, integration always starts with providing information. So students need and families need to be aware of how host countries' education systems function, and we see that essentially all countries that we surveyed make information material available. These are usually websites and brochures, quite frequently, but not always. They are translated in Ukrainian and Russian. And then we see a few particular examples where, for example, Poland has set up a hotline and a chat box to inform about the Polish education system. I believe Estonia posts messages in Ukrainian Facebook communities, but I'm sure that our Estonian colleague knows much more about this than I do. And France, for example, has sent a joint letter together with the Ukrainian Ministry of Education to all Ukrainian refugees in France to inform them about schooling in France. But there's one important aspect that I would like to highlight that comes from an example from Denmark, and that is that the need for information, of course, always goes both ways. So it's not only families and students that need to know about the education system of their host countries. It's also that teachers in host countries need to understand the Ukrainian education system if they want to target their teaching to the needs of Ukrainian students. And therefore I think it's quite a relevant initiative that Denmark makes information material on the Ukrainian school system available to Danish teachers. Now talking about access to early childhood education and care programs, we see that this is offered in virtually all OECD countries that we surveyed. Usually access to ECEC is made available at the same terms as for residents of the host countries, and that is of course important not only for the children that have the opportunity to learn the host country language, but also for parents that get the opportunity to work or study. However, I think it's important to take this figure, this 86%, with a little grain of salt, because of course it doesn't mean that in 86% of countries access to early childhood education and care is completely without barriers for refugees. We know that in some cases administrative procedures can be quite complex, and that may be a barrier, especially in the early stages of the refugees' arrival. The availability of childcare places is another issue. So waiting lists can be quite long, and if refugees after their arrival they end up at the bottom of the waiting list, it can take months, or in some cases even years, until a spot is available. And then last but not least, childcare costs can also be a barrier. There are programs in many countries to subsidize childcare for refugees or low-income families in general, but not refugees are not eligible for such support in all countries, and in some countries there are also other conditions attached to financial support, such as, for example, a need for the parents to have a job, and that of course can also be a significant barrier for refugees. Now looking to primary and secondary education, important question is of course whether students are integrated into classes with national students or whether they are assigned to dedicated programs. Here we see quite a bit of diversity across OECD countries. In little less than 2/3 of the OECD countries, we have integration primarily into regular education programs. In 10 OECD countries focus on have a mixed approach where they integrate children both in regular and in dedicated programs, and actually only 2 countries pursue an approach where they integrate Ukrainian children primarily into dedicated programs. The criteria according to which this is decided, they can vary quite a bit from country to country. The most common criteria is certainly the level of education or the age of the children, where younger children tend to be integrated into regular classes, whereas older children are more likely to be integrated into dedicated programs. The capacity of schools is another criteria that is applied, for example, in Austria, Lithuania, and the Netherlands. France and New Zealand make it dependent on the proficiency in the host country's language. In Luxembourg, it's the parents' choice, and Poland makes this decision based on the learning progress. Now, one important aspect that I would like to highlight that I find quite interesting is actually to look at the level of government that makes these decisions. And here we see that there's a huge diversity. In around 1/3 of the cases, it's actually the national level that determines the criteria for whether students are integrated into general classes or in dedicated programs. In a few countries, it's the regional level, and others the city level. The school level also exists, and in 17% of the countries, it's actually the decision is made at multiple levels of government. Now, why am I highlighting this point? It's not so much that the level of government is particularly relevant for this specific issue, but I think it the diversity that we see here illustrates the diversity in governance arrangements that we see in general when it comes to education policies with respect to Ukrainian refugees. So many countries are using similar measures, but the implementation actually differs quite a bit from country to country. And from this, I think we can learn, or we can take away several messages. One of them is, of course, that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. So there are multiple ways to arrive at the same objective. But at the same time, it also means that countries need to monitor whether the approach they have chosen is effective, or whether there are not perhaps other more effective approaches to solve a particular problem. And last but not least, it also highlights that the coordination across levels of government is important, because often it's not only one level of government that is involved in these decisions, but it's multiple levels that need to take related decisions that need to be coordinated across each other. Okay, now coming back to the issue of the integration of Ukrainian refugees, one important issue are the catch-up courses that are offered to Ukrainian students. Again, this is the case almost everywhere. So we have 86% of countries responded that they systematically offer additional catch-up courses. Primarily, of course, this focuses on language courses, which is no surprise. But again, we see that there's a huge diversity in how these courses are set up. So some countries offer in-person language courses of the host country language. Others do it online. Sometimes these language courses are combined with other subjects. Sometimes they are held during school hours. Sometimes they are part of extracurricular activities. Some countries have set up dedicated courses only for Ukrainian refugees. Other countries have joined courses together with students from other non-native backgrounds. And then there are, in addition to language courses, we also see there are a few other approaches that some countries pursue. So, for example, Denmark and Greece have dedicated reception classes that focus on basic education in the host country's language, and Italy has implemented a peer education and tutoring model where students are paired with peers from Italy, who will support them during the first weeks and month in the country. Coming to a point that Lucy has already mentioned, and that is very important, unfortunately, that is the psychological support for refugees. Many Ukrainian children are traumatized due to the war and due to their flight. And it's good to see that there is psychological support in the vast majority of countries. However, we also see that in less than 1/3 of the countries, that support is actually dedicated to Ukrainian children. In a larger number of countries, it is actually the general psychological support programs that are open to Ukrainian refugees. For example, school psychologists or social support of children and their families that we have in Finland, Italy, Poland, and Portugal. Now let me speak about access to tertiary education. That's something that many countries are focusing on. And again, we see that in the vast majority of the countries that we have surveyed, there are dedicated measures to facilitate university access for Ukrainian students. But here we really see a huge diversity in different approaches that have been implemented by countries. So on the administrative side, we have various forms of administrative support. For example, Canada is fast-tracking applications from Ukrainian students. Belgium has set up specific registration days for Ukrainian students. Ireland supports prospective students with the translation of documents. Denmark has implemented flexibility when it comes to the application deadlines. Then there is support when it comes to the recognition of prior qualifications of refugees. There's a fast-track process for recognizing those qualifications that has been implemented, for example, in Belgium, Portugal, and Spain. And then there's one very important aspect, that is the financial support for students. Many countries have implemented financial support measures for Ukrainian students. These can be, for example, fee exonerations or reductions that we see in Belgium, Italy, Poland, and Sweden. There are dedicated study grants and scholarships for Ukrainian students in Belgium, Latvia, Lithuania, Spain, Switzerland, and the UK. France offers social grants and student housing, and the US makes on and off campus employment opportunities available for Ukrainian university students. Of course, language is also an issue at the tertiary level, and several countries are offering dedicated language courses. Spain and Switzerland are just some examples. And last but not least, social and emotional support is also relevant at the tertiary level, and Spain, for example, is offering dedicated psychological counseling for university students. Okay, now I'm already getting close to the end of my presentation, but I would like to take a few more minutes to speak about measures to ensure pedagogical continuity for Ukrainian students. So what are OECD countries doing to help Ukrainian students to maintain their links with Ukraine? We see again that such measures are implemented in the majority of the cases. In 43% of the countries, that's actually the case as part of the mainstream education, whereas in a good third of the countries, this is being done as part of extracurricular or complementary activities. And when it comes to examples of those arrangements, we see that many countries make teaching material available in Ukrainian or in Russian. And then there are many countries that have implemented various measures to support distance learning. For example, Portugal and Switzerland are offering computers to Ukrainian refugees to connect to the Ukrainian online curriculum. Greece, Luxembourg, and Finland have implemented dedicated distance learning platforms. Portugal, again, is offering flexibility in the timetable of students so that they can follow the Ukrainian curriculum, and Lithuania and Slovenia actually making it possible for Ukrainian students to obtain a Ukrainian diploma. And this is already my last slide, just to talk briefly about the recruitment of Ukrainian teaching staff to ensure pedagogical community. We see that quite a few countries have implemented dedicated measures to recruit Ukrainian staff. In 8 countries, this focuses in particular on Ukrainian teachers, whereas 7 countries target Ukrainian refugees with adequate qualifications more broadly. And it should also be mentioned that in another 7 countries, those policies have not yet been implemented, but they are planned for the future. Perhaps just one last thing to mention, that even though many countries target especially Ukrainian teachers, at this point, most countries are actually not employing them as full-time teachers, but more commonly as teaching assistants or in counseling and pedagogical support roles. With this, I'm already at the end of my slides, but before I end the presentation, I would just like to say a big thank you to our colleagues in national ministries who really provided a lot of support to this survey, and provided a lot of very detailed information that allowed us to provide you with these results that I just presented, and that actually go quite a bit beyond what I've shown in this presentation. And this is really very valuable. So thank you very much for this. Thanks.